The wind out on those plains didn't just bite, it had teeth. And Zacharias Steele rode through it like a man who'd already been chewed up and spit out. Most of his face was hidden under the brim of a hat that had seen better decades, but you couldn't miss the scar. It wasn't a clean line from a sword or a knife. It was a jagged, ugly mess that hooked down from his jaw and tore through his cheek, like something with claws had tried to rip his face clean off. It was the kind of mark that made people either stare too long or look away too fast. Zacharias preferred it when they looked away. He worked cattle, fixed fences, did whatever paid enough to keep him moving and keep folks from asking questions. He was a ghost who paid his bills and slept with a gun under his pillow. And that morning, he found her. She was stranded by a dry creek bed, the frost clinging to everything like a second skin. Her wagon was a wreck, one wheel completely splintered. The mule that should have been there was just gone. A little girl sat on a rock, clutching a doll with one arm missing, while a smaller one hid behind his mother's skirts, his eyes wide and empty. Zacharias pulled his horse to a stop, and the sound made the woman look up. She had a rifle in her hand, and she held it like she knew how to use it. Her hair was braided tight, her clothes were worn, but they were clean. She had the eyes of someone who'd seen the world for what it was and wasn't impressed. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice a gravel road. "No," she said, her own voice steady as a rock. "But we're stranded." He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture, and swung down from his horse. She didn't lower the rifle, not right away. "I'm not here to harm you," he said. "Name's Zacharias Steele. Was just passing through." The little girl on the rock shivered and tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, I'm cold." The woman finally, slowly, set the rifle down. "I'm Theodora Granger. This is Elaine and Emmett." She glanced at the shattered wheel. "We were headed south. My husband passed 2 winters ago, trying to get to my cousin's land." Zacharias crouched down, his eyes scanning the damage. The wheel was bad enough, but it was the axle that told the real story. It was cracked clean through. There was no fixing this out here. "You got shelter?" he asked. She shook her head. "Food? Enough for a day, maybe 2. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Nothing. Just endless, empty land under a steel-gray sky. He could leave them. He could just get back on his horse and ride away, and no one would ever know. But he didn't. He looked back at the woman and her 2 small children, and he saw something that stopped him cold. It was the way she held herself, defiant, proud. But underneath it, there was a terror she was trying to hide. And it wasn't just the terror of being stranded. It was something else, something much, much worse. "My cabin's not far," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. 3 hours' ride. I'll take you there." Her eyes narrowed into slits. "Why?" He just shrugged. "Because winter's coming." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. She looked at his face, really looked at him, her gaze lingering on the scar for a moment before meeting his eyes, and in that moment, he saw her make a calculation. Was this man, this broken stranger, more dangerous than whatever she was running from? Apparently not. "All right," she said. He loaded her trunk onto his pack horse, then lifted the children, Emmett and Elaine, onto his own mount. The little boy gripped his coat like he was drowning. "You can ride with them," Zacharias told her. "I'll walk." Theodora hesitated, then climbed up behind her children without another word. He led the horse as the sun bled across the sky, painting it in shades of orange and bruised purple. The wind howled. The children slept. They reached the cabin as the last of the light died. It wasn't much, just a small box made of wood and stone, with a lean-to for firewood. But it was warm. He got a fire going in the hearth, and Theodora moved around the small space like she'd been doing it her whole life, helping without being asked. He gave them the only bed. He took the floor by the door, his back to the wall, just like always. Later, after the children were asleep, she stood by the fire. He was sharpening his knife, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the cabin. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. He didn't look up from his work. "Why do you travel alone with 2 kids and a broken wagon?" A small sigh escaped her lips. "Because I had no choice." He finally met her gaze. "Same." She watched him for a long time, her eyes tracing the path of the scar on his face. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Was it war?" "No," he said. The word clipped. "Bandits. Left me for dead." She took a step closer. "And you survived." His eyes were dark pools in the firelight. "I'm not sure that's the word I'd use." The silence that followed was heavy. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. And Zacharias couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, Theodora Granger, was hiding a lie bigger than his scar. Because when he'd looked at that broken wagon axle, he'd seen something that didn't make any sense. The wood wasn't splintered from a rock or a rut. It was cut. Clean through. Someone had taken a saw to it. Someone had made sure that wagon wasn't going anywhere. Days turned into a week. Zacharias worked on the wagon, whittling a new axle from a fallen pine, the work slow and deliberate. Theodora fell into a routine, cooking, cleaning, caring for the children. She was quiet, but efficient. She never spoke of her past, and he never asked. But he watched her. He saw the way her eyes would dart toward the window whenever a branch snapped outside. He saw how she flinched if he moved too quickly. This wasn't a woman mourning a husband. This was a woman on the run. One night, Emmett came down with a fever. The boy shivered and cried out in the dark, and Zacharias found himself sitting by the bed, placing cool cloths on the child's forehead. Theodora sat in the chair across the room, her rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. Not on her sick son, but on the door. It was a small thing, but it was wrong. In the morning, the fever had broken. "You didn't have to do that," Theodora said, her voice strained. "I know," he replied. Then the snow came. It fell thick and fast, a white curtain that dropped over the world, burying the plains, the trees, the broken wagon. They were trapped. "You should stay the winter," Zacharias said. It wasn't a question. She just nodded, her eyes looking out at the endless white. "All right." The days grew shorter. The nights grew longer. The small cabin became their entire world, and the tension inside it grew thicker than the snow outside. He'd find her staring into the fire, her hands clenched into fists. He'd wake in the dead of night to find her standing by the window, peering out into the storm. He started sleeping with his gun not just under his pillow, but in his hand. One evening, after the children were asleep, she found him cleaning his rifle by the fire. "You're always ready for a fight, aren't you?" she said. He worked the oilcloth along the barrel. "Out here, you have to be." She sat across from him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Who are you so afraid of, Zacharias?" He stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw the same question reflected in her gaze. "Maybe you should tell me who you're afraid of, Theodora." Her face went pale. For a second, he thought she would deny it. But instead, she stood up and walked to her trunk in the corner of the room. She lifted the lid, and from beneath a pile of worn clothes, she pulled out a leather satchel. It was heavy, too heavy. She placed it on the table between them and unbuckled the straps. She didn't have to open it. He could already smell it. Money, a lot of it, and something else. Stamped on the leather of the satchel was a brand, a coiled snake eating its own tail. He'd seen that brand before. He'd seen it just before the world went black, just before the claws of a blade had ripped his face open. It was the mark of the Ouroboros gang. The same men he'd told her were bandits. The same men who had left him for dead. And suddenly he understood. The broken wagon, the fear in her eyes, the rifle she never let out of her sight. Her husband hadn't passed 2 winters ago. Her husband was Thomas Granger, the leader of the Ouroboros gang. And Theodora hadn't just run away from him. She had robbed him blind. She hadn't stumbled into his life by accident. She had brought hell right to his doorstep. Zacharias stared at the satchel on the table. The coiled snake seemed to mock him. Everything clicked into place, each piece of the puzzle locking into a terrifying picture. He wasn't a savior. He was a stepping stone, a temporary shelter for a woman who was being hunted by the most vicious cutthroats this side of the territories. "Your husband," he said, his voice dangerously low. "He's not dead, is he?" Theodora sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the fire. "No, he's not dead." She finally looked at him, and her expression was a mixture of fear and defiance. "He told everyone he died in a mine collapse. It was a lie. He wanted to disappear. Start fresh with this." She gestured to the bag of money. "But he didn't want to disappear with me, or the children." The story tumbled out of her then, a torrent of secrets she'd held back for months. Thomas Granger wasn't just a bandit. He was a monster. He ruled his gang and his family with the same iron fist. The beatings, the threats, the cold, dead look in his eyes when he talked about the men he'd killed. She'd finally found her chance to escape when he'd sent the gang on a raid, leaving her alone with the money. She'd sabotaged her own wagon, hoping to find a place to lay low, to disappear before Thomas realized she was gone. She'd chosen this direction, this empty stretch of land, because no one ever came here. And then she'd found Zacharias. A man with a face so broken, she figured he, too, wanted to be left alone. She thought he was a haven, a wall to hide behind. But now the truth was out, sitting between them like a loaded gun. "They'll come for you," Zacharias said. It wasn't a question. "They'll come for the money," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. "And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." He stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the rough-spun curtain. The snow was still falling, a relentless, silent siege. It had been their prison. Now it was their only defense. It would buy them time, but not enough. "How long do we have?" he asked, his back still to her. "I don't know. A week. A month. Until the thaw. A month. A month until a man he thought was long dead came to reclaim his wife, his children, and his money. A month until the ghosts of his past rode up to his front door to finish the job they'd started years ago. He turned from the window, his eyes finding hers across the room. The fear was still there, but something else had taken its place. A flicker of hope. She had confessed her secret, and he hadn't thrown her out into the storm. "You should leave," she said quietly. "Take your horse. Ride north. They don't know about you." He almost laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Leave? Where would he go? He'd been running from these men in his own way for years, hiding in this self-imposed exile. He'd thought he was a ghost, but a ghost can't bleed. A ghost can't feel the cold seep into his bones, and a ghost can't look at 2 sleeping children and feel a protective rage so fierce it burned away the fear. He walked back to the table and picked up his rifle. He checked the action, his movements sure and practiced. "No," he said, not looking at her. "I don't run." He finally met her gaze, and for the first time she saw the man he had been before the scar. Not a broken ranch hand, but something harder. Something far more dangerous. "This is my home," he said, his voice like flint striking steel. "They are not welcome here." The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a fortress, and the man she thought was a hermit was about to become a soldier. The war she had run from had finally caught up to her, and it was about to begin right here, in this tiny cabin, in the middle of a winter storm. The next few days were a blur of silent preparation. The unspoken truce between them had solidified into an alliance. Zacharias spent hours outside in the biting cold, reinforcing the cabin. He boarded up the small back window, packed snow and ice into the gaps between the logs, creating a crude but effective layer of armor. He carved firing slits into the heavy wooden shutters, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. He wasn't just fixing a home. He was preparing a kill box. Inside, Theodora took stock of their supplies. Every bullet was counted. Every scrap of food was rationed. She melted down lead scraps over the fire, her hands surprisingly steady as she molded new rounds for the rifles. She showed him a small pistol she'd kept hidden in her trunk, a Derringer, small enough to hide in her sleeve. "Thomas gave it to me," she said, her voice flat. "He said a woman should have a way to protect herself. He just never thought I'd need to protect myself from him." The children, Elaine and Emmett, knew something was wrong. The air in the cabin was thick with a tension they couldn't understand. They played their quiet games by the fire, their laughter seeming too loud in the heavy silence. Zacharias found himself watching them, a strange ache in his chest. He was getting ready to turn their home into a battlefield, to protect a family that wasn't his, from a past that was. He was fighting for a life he never thought he'd have. One afternoon he was on the roof, clearing the heavy snow from the chimney when he saw it. A flicker of movement on the far ridge. It wasn't a deer or a wolf. It was a man on horseback, a dark silhouette against the white snow. A scout. They were here. He slid down from the roof, his boots hitting the packed snow with a soft thud. He didn't run. He walked calmly back into the cabin and bolted the door behind him. Theodora looked up from where she was kneading dough, her hands white with flour. She saw the look on his face and didn't need to ask. Her own face went pale, but her hands didn't tremble. "How many?" she whispered. "Just one. For now." He moved to the window, peering through the firing slit. The scout was gone. But he'd be back, and he wouldn't be alone. "They'll wait," Zacharias said, thinking aloud. "They'll wait for the storm to break, or they'll wait for us to run low on food. They'll surround us and try to starve us out." Theodora came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Thomas is not a patient man. He won't wait long." She was right. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the logs, every howl of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. The sun would rise and set, and with each passing hour, the knot in Zacharias's stomach tightened. He and Theodora barely spoke. They moved around each other, two soldiers preparing for a battle they knew they would likely lose. They ate in shifts. They slept in shifts. One of them was always awake, always watching. One night, as he stood watch, Theodora brought him a cup of hot broth. She stood beside him in the dark, the faint glow from the dying embers of the fire casting long shadows on the walls. "You never told me the real story," she said, "about your scar." He took a sip of the broth, the warmth doing little to thaw the ice in his gut. He stared out into the blackness. "There's not much to tell. I was a marshal, had a team. We got close to taking down the Ouroboros gang, too close." He paused, the memory still raw, still sharp. "We got word they were holed up in an old mining camp. We went in. But it was a trap. They were waiting for us. They killed everyone. My whole team." His hand unconsciously went to his face, his fingers tracing the ruined flesh. "Thomas Granger did this himself, with a skinning knife. He wanted me to live. He wanted me to remember." Theodora was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with a venom he hadn't heard before. "He likes to leave his mark on people." Zacharias finally turned to look at her. "He took my life that day. I just kept breathing." She reached out, her fingers gently touching his hand. "He won't take anything else from you, from us." The very next morning, the attack came. It wasn't a full-on assault. It was a test. A single rifle shot cracked through the dawn quiet, splintering the wood of the doorframe just inches from Zacharias's head. He didn't flinch. He just raised his own rifle to the firing slit and waited. The waiting game was over. The siege had begun. The first day was a series of probing attacks. A shot here, a shot there. They were testing their defenses, trying to draw their fire, trying to see how many people were inside. Zacharias and Theodora didn't fall for it. They held their ground, only returning fire when they had a clear shot, making every bullet count. The gang was hidden in the trees surrounding the cabin, just dark shapes moving through the snow. By nightfall, a tense quiet had fallen. The children were huddled under the bed, their faces tear-streaked. Theodora tried to comfort them, her voice a low, soothing hum, but Zacharias could see the terror in her eyes. This was the life she had tried to escape, brought home to roost. He kept watch by the window, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. He knew Thomas Granger's tactics. He knew the man's cruelty. The physical assault was just the beginning. The real war would be fought in their minds. And sure enough, just after midnight, a voice called out from the darkness. It was a calm, almost friendly voice, but it chilled Zacharias to the bone. It was Thomas Granger. "Theodora, my love," the voice crooned, echoing across the snow. "This has gone on long enough. You've had your little adventure. Bring me my money and my children, and I'll let your cowboy friend live." Theodora froze. Her face was a mask of pure hatred. "Don't listen to him," Zacharias murmured, his rifle still aimed into the darkness. "He's lying," she whispered back. "He'll kill us all." "I know." The voice came again, closer this time. "I can see you in there, hiding in that little box. You think he can protect you? Look at his face, Theodora. That's what happens to men who cross me. Is that what you want for your children?" Emmett let out a small sob from under the bed. Theodora's knuckles were white where she gripped her pistol. Thomas was trying to break her. He was using their children, using Zacharias's own past as a weapon. Zacharias knew he had to do something. He couldn't let Granger control the narrative. He raised his voice, shouting into the night. "You want your money, Granger? Come and get it." A harsh laugh answered him from the darkness. "Oh, I will, Marshal. I'm going to enjoy finishing what I started." "Marshal?" The word hung in the air inside the cabin. Theodora turned to look at him, her eyes wide with a new understanding. It wasn't just a random act of violence, it was personal. This was a blood feud. "And this time," Granger's voice snarled, losing its calm facade, "I'll make sure you stay dead." A volley of rifle fire erupted from the trees, slamming into the cabin walls. Wood splintered. The children screamed. The battle had escalated. They weren't just being shot at anymore. They were being hunted by a man who knew exactly who he was trying to kill. And he had brought an army with him. The night was a nightmare of noise and fear. Bullets thudded into the log walls like angry fists. The children cried themselves to sleep, their small bodies trembling under the bed. Zacharias and Theodora stayed at their posts, two grim sentinels guarding the flickering flame of their family. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They were caught in a trap, surrounded by at least a half-dozen men, maybe more. Their only hope was that the gang's desire for the money outweighed their patience. As dawn approached, the shooting stopped. An eerie silence descended, more unnerving than the gunfire. Zacharias scanned the tree line, his eyes burning from exhaustion. He knew this was a tactic. Granger was letting them stew in their fear, letting them imagine what was coming next. Theodora brought him a piece of hardtack and a tin cup of water. "We're low on ammunition," she said, her voice hoarse. He nodded. He'd counted the remaining cartridges. They had maybe 30 rounds between them, enough for a few minutes of a real fight, not enough to survive a sustained assault. "He wants the money intact," Zacharias reasoned, mostly to himself. "He won't risk burning us out. Not yet." "What will he do then?" she asked. Before he could answer, a new sound reached them, a rhythmic thudding from the direction of the woods. Thud. Pause. Thud. It was the sound of an axe striking wood. "What are they doing?" Theodora whispered. Zacharias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were building something. He remembered the old logging camp stories. He remembered the tales of sieges and desperate measures. "A battering ram," he said, the words tasting like ash. "They're going to come right through the door." Theodora's face hardened. She looked at the heavy oak door, then at the children sleeping fitfully on the floor. "No," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "They will not get in here." But they both knew the door wouldn't hold. The heavy bar he'd reinforced it with would snap. The hinges would tear loose. It was only a matter of time. And time was the one thing they had run out of. Zacharias's mind raced, fight or flight. There was nowhere to run, so they would have to fight. But not like this, not cornered animals waiting for the slaughter. They had to change the game. He looked around the small cabin, his eyes landing on the hearth. The fire was burning low, but the stones were still hot. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. "The floorboards," he said, turning to Theodora. "Help me pull up the floorboards by the fireplace." She looked at him confused, but she didn't question him. Together they used the tips of their knives to pry up the rough-hewn planks. Beneath them was nothing but the cold, dark earth of the foundation. "The root cellar," he explained, his voice urgent. "Every cabin like this has one. A place to store food for the winter. There should be a tunnel." He was right. Hidden beneath another layer of smaller boards was a dark, square opening. A wave of musty, cold air rose to meet them. It was a small, cramped space, but it led out. A narrow tunnel, just big enough for a person to crawl through, snaked away from the cabin foundation, ending under a pile of rocks about 50 yards away near the creek bed. It was a last-ditch escape route, built by whatever long-dead trapper had first settled this land. It was their only chance. "Here's the plan," he said, his voice low and fast. "You take the children, you take the money, you get through that tunnel. As soon as you're clear, you run. Don't look back, head for the river, follow it south. You'll hit a settlement eventually." Theodora stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "What about you?" "I'm going to stay here," he said. "I'm going to give Thomas Granger the fight he wants." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You have to protect them." He looked over at Elaine and Emmett. "He can't get his hands on them. Do you understand? You have to get them out of here." The thudding of the axe outside grew louder, closer. They were running out of seconds. The raw emotion in the cabin was suffocating. She looked from his face to her children, her heart tearing in two. To run meant leaving him to die. To stay meant they all died together. He saw the war in her eyes. He made the choice for her. He grabbed the satchel of money and shoved it into her arms. "Go! Now!" Then he leaned in and kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of gunpowder and fear. It was a goodbye. She hesitated for one more second, then her survival instinct took over. She woke the children, her hands shaking as she pulled them toward the hole in the floor. Elaine was crying silently. Emmett was too scared to make a sound. "Be brave," she whispered to them. "We're playing a game." She lowered Emmett into the darkness. Then Elaine. Before she went down herself, she turned back to Zacharias. Her face was a mess of tears and determination. "I love you," she whispered. He just nodded, unable to speak. The word was too big, too new. He watched her disappear into the earth. Then he replaced the floorboards, scattering a rug over them just as a thunderous crash shook the entire cabin. The battering ram had hit the door. He moved to the window, his rifle ready. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a marshal again. and he was about to deliver a final, brutal piece of justice. The door splintered, then buckled. He was out of time. But so were they. The door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. Two men charged through the opening, rifles raised. Zacharias fired twice, his shots echoing like thunder in the small space. Both men dropped without a sound. He didn't have time to feel anything. Two more were right behind them. He ducked behind the heavy wooden table as bullets ripped through the air where he'd been standing. He fired from the floor, aiming for legs. One of the men screamed and went down, clutching his knee. The other dove for cover. Outside, Thomas Granger was shouting orders. "He's alone! Get in there! I want him alive!" Zacharias knew what that meant. He wasn't going to get a quick death. Granger wanted to make it last. He scrambled back to the rear of the cabin, using the meager cover of the stone hearth. He could hear them moving outside, circling the cabin like wolves. He was pinned down. He only had a few bullets left. He thought of Theodora and the children, crawling through the cold, dark earth. He prayed they were far enough away. He prayed they were safe. Then, a new sound. Fire. He could smell the smoke, see the orange glow flickering through the firing slits. They were trying to burn him out after all. Granger's patience had finally snapped. Thick black smoke began to pour through the gaps in the log walls. The cabin was turning into a death trap. His lungs burned, his eyes watered. He was choking, coughing, struggling to breathe. Through the haze, he saw a figure step through the broken doorway. It was Thomas Granger. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding the same skinning knife that had carved up Zacharias's face. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his lips. "Nowhere left to run, Marshal," Granger snarled, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "I told you I'd finish the job." Zacharias raised his rifle, but a violent coughing fit racked his body. The rifle slipped from his grasp. He was on his knees, weak, disoriented. Granger stalked toward him, the knife held low. "This is for my money," he hissed, "and for my wife." He lunged. But just as Granger lunged, another sound cut through the roar of the fire. A gunshot. Not from inside the cabin, from outside. Granger stopped, a look of confusion on his face. He staggered, looking down at his chest where a dark red stain was spreading across his shirt. He turned toward the broken doorway, and so did Zacharias. Standing in the snow, surrounded by the bodies of Granger's men, was Theodora. She was holding her rifle, a thin tendril of smoke curling from the barrel. She hadn't run. She had sent the children ahead into the woods, told them to hide and not make a sound. Then she had circled back. She had hunted them. One by one, in the chaos of the assault, she had picked them off from the cover of the trees. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. Granger stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You!" he choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. "I told you I was done running," Theodora said, her voice ringing with cold fury. She raised the rifle and fired again. The shot hit Granger square in the heart. He collapsed to the floor of the burning cabin, his dead eyes staring up at the man he had failed to kill twice. Zacharias scrambled to his feet, grabbing Theodora's arm and pulling her away from the inferno. They stumbled out into the snow, coughing, gasping for the clean, cold air. The cabin that had been their home, their fortress, was being consumed by flames. They stood there for a moment, watching it burn, the heat warming their faces. It was an ending, and a beginning. They found the children huddled together under the roots of a fallen pine tree, cold and terrified, but safe. Theodora gathered them in her arms, burying her face in their hair, her body shaking with sobs of relief. Zacharias stood watch, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the silent, empty woods. The threat was gone. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. They spent the rest of the day burying the dead. It was grim work, but it needed to be done. They didn't speak of what had happened. The shared trauma, the violence, the victory. It was a language that needed no words. That night, they huddled together for warmth in the lean-to, wrapped in blankets they'd salvaged from the pack horse. The ruins of the cabin smoldered nearby, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. Emmett and Elaine slept between them, finally at peace. Theodora rested her head on Zacharias's shoulder. "What do we do now?" she whispered. He looked at the bag of money, then at her and the children. He thought of the life he'd lost and the one he had just fought for. "We build," he said. "We build it all again, together." And they did. The spring thaw came, washing away the snow and the blood. With Granger's money, they bought supplies from the settlement downriver. They bought lumber, tools, seeds, and 2 strong mules. Zacharias, with Theodora by his side, built a new cabin on the ashes of the old one. It was bigger this time, with 2 rooms and a real porch. They dug a new well. They tilled the earth and planted a garden. The land that had once been a place of exile became a place of promise. They were married by a traveling preacher under a cottonwood tree. Elaine and Emmett stood beside them, their faces shining. A year later, Theodora gave birth to a son, a boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady eyes. They named him Caleb. The scar on Zacharias's face was still there. It would always be there. But when he looked in the mirror now, he didn't see a broken man. He saw a husband, a father, a man who had faced down his own personal hell and walked out the other side, holding the hand of the woman who had saved him. The quiet life he thought was a punishment had become his greatest reward. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the crackle of a warm fire, and the steady, comforting presence of the family he had built from the ashes. He had found his peace, not in forgetting the past, but in fighting for a future. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and had not just survived, but thrived. The story of the scarred man and the brave widow who took down the Ouroboros gang became a quiet legend in the territory, a tale whispered around campfires. But for Zacharias and Theodora, it was just their life. A life forged in fire and fear, and sealed with a love that was stronger than any scar. They had found in each other not just a safe harbor but a home, and they defended it together for all the days that followed. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the deepest scars are the ones you can't see, and that true strength isn't about never being afraid, but about fighting for something you love, even when you are. If you were in Zacharias's shoes, would you have helped a stranger like Theodora knowing the risk? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.